asked to talk about it.
Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of the limitation rules of the subcommittee. I will proceed with the opening statement, then we'll have the ranking member and the other committee members make comments as well. There are a lot of things we don't know about the Benghazi attack that killed Americans, including our Ambassador, Chris Stevens. During her testimony before Congress earlier this year, Secretary Clinton responded to questioning over the cause of the attack of Benghazi by saying, quote, "What difference at this point does it make?" It does make a difference. It makes a difference to the victims' families who want justice, and it also makes a difference to the United States. Understanding why the attack happened does matter. We must respond to any type of violent attack that occurs against Americans, no matter where it is, when it's a terrorist attack. The morning after the Benghazi attack, I said it on the House floor that this was a terrorist attack. Everyone, including the administration, now knows and recognizes that this was a terrorist attack. I do look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about what the security environment in Libya was like, what it was like before the attack, what terrorist groups in Libya were there at the time. Was there any indication that a terrorist attack was probable against Americans? What was the response of other governments with embassies in Libya to the threat of the terrorist group? And what is the American response? And has it been any different since the days of the attack? The security environment in Libya after the attack is also important to understand. An FBI team was on the ground in Libya investigating, but supposedly it wasn't even safe for them to spend much time in Benghazi to determine what happened. I don't know how they plan to capture those responsible if they can't go to the area where the perpetrators act. At this late date, with all the intelligence that the United States has at its disposal, do we know the persons that committed these murders? If we do know who they are, why aren't they in custody? I've heard from journalists who have traveled to Benghazi that the identities of at least some of the attackers are known, as is their whereabouts. One of them openly drank coffee every morning in the same cafe after the attack. So why has no one been brought to justice, not even at this date? The idea that 4 Americans can die on sovereign U.S. soil and almost a year later no one has been held accountable is contrary to what we stand for in this nation. The United States is the most powerful nation in the world. Are we afraid to arrest those who take out or who commit terrorist acts against the United States? There must be consequences for killing Americans. If there isn't consequences, that just encourages terrorists to act even more. Terrorists will grow more daring in their attacks and put more Americans in danger if no consequences from the United States occur. They should know, all terrorists should know, that they cannot kill Americans and get away with it. As a former judge, I believe that at the courthouse there should be justice, and justice should continue, and the long arm of American justice should reach to areas where Americans are murdered by terrorists. We know what happened in Libya did not stay in Libya. In May, this subcommittee held a joint hearing on the growing crisis in the African region. Arms which the administration apparently allowed to be smuggled to extremist hands during the Libyan revolution found their way into terrorist hands throughout the region in North Africa. It wasn't long before Mali was overrun with terrorists and the French had to come in and prevent the whole country from collapsing. It soon spread to Algeria when on January the 16th, 2013, an al-Qaeda-linked Islamic militant group called Those Who Sign in Blood took nearly 800 people hostage at the gas plant in Algeria. After a tense 4-day hostage standoff, Algerian special forces raided the facility in an effort to free the hostages, and more than 80 people, including 3 Americans, were killed. These Americans were killed for who they were, because they were Americans. There are many unanswered questions that remain. Why did the United States not take direct action to protect American interests and American citizens? 3 Americans died. I've been told that American forces were within a few miles of the facility, ready to assist in the rescue, but were told to stand down. Is this true? And if so, why? Why did we allow the safety of our citizens to depend on the acts of another country? And why haven't we responded or held anyone accountable for these murders that took place in January? Today we have with us the brother of one of those victims. Mike Lovelady is here with his family, including his wife Wanda and Victor's wife Maureen and their family as well. I want to thank the Lovelady family for being here today, and we are all sorry for the loss of a loved one, and let you know that Victor and the other victims from the Algeria attack will not be forgotten, and it is our hope that we find out who committed these murders and hold them accountable. But I do want to thank the Lovelady family for coming in from Texas to be here today. The mastermind behind the deadly attack was allegedly an Algerian militant named Mokhtar Belmokhtar. He claimed the attack was in retaliation for Algeria's support of the French military offensive against Islamist insurgents in neighboring Mali. So from Libya to Mali to Algeria, it's obvious that terrorism is running loose in North Africa. We need to learn from our lessons about these terrorist attacks. We should not push these attacks behind closed doors and pretend just to move on down the road. The families of the 4 American victims in Benghazi have not moved on. The Loveladies have not moved on. The FBI investigation has not moved on at all. And the United States Congress should not move on until these answers, do we have answers about what happened in Benghazi and what happened in Algeria, not until we have justice. I will now turn over to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can digress one country to the east and talk about Egypt for just a second. If we had a functioning democracy and government here in the United States, the administration would be conferring with Congress as to what would be the best policy and how quickly we could modify our statutes in order to have those statutes call for the best policy, particularly with regard to our aid under these circumstances. Instead, we've got White House lawyers trying to figure out how to say what happened in Egypt isn't a coup. And the entire country will accept that because the entire country has reached the conclusion that Congress is so dysfunctional that the idea of conferring with Congress and having Congress change a statute seems silly when a statute can simply be ignored or twisted out of all shape. As we work for democracy in the Middle East, I look forward to focusing on our institutions here. That's why, with regard to Libya, I was so concerned about the enforcement of the War Powers Act, which, in an effort to bring democracy to Libya, was not actually adhered to, which is always a good idea with regard to statutes. Focusing again on the past in Libya, we had a chance then to demand that the rebels purge from their midst the worst elements. Amongst them, we did not. We were all too anxious to see a collection of the best and worst forces of Libya overthrow Gaddafi, and now those worst forces exercise substantial power, particularly in eastern Libya. It is thought to be a proof of one's dull-headedness if you worry about a few $1 billion here or there, when there's the great issues of war and peace, whereas you can always get a few more $1 billion from the American taxpayer. But the fact is, we should have insisted that the Libyans pay for the overthrow of Gaddafi, the costs that we incurred. We could have asked for that pledge early. I met with some of the top people during the rebellion, and they said, the message we have is, don't worry about reimbursing the U.S. taxpayer. Just make sure you give good deals to U.S. oil companies. At the time, I thought this gentleman from the Middle East misunderstood my government and its objectives. It appears to me now that he understood my government better than I do. I look forward to a government that focuses on billions of dollars for American taxpayers. This also focuses our attention on the cost of aid to the Iraqi government, a government which is using billions of dollars to pay its debts to Kuwait, because Kuwait lent money to Saudi Arabia to wage a war of aggression against not Saudi Arabia, lent money to Saddam Hussein to wage his war against Iran. So we have to give money to the Iraqis so they can give money to the Kuwaitis, a country that still exists just because we defended them from Saddam Hussein, also at our own cost. There's substantial argument here in this city about why there seemed to be a misstatement of what motivated those who attacked our embassy in Benghazi. I want to put to rest, if it can, I don't think it can be put to rest, but at least expose the silliness of the idea that this was some sort of grand political plan. Because if one says that terrorists hit our embassy in Benghazi, it proves that our foreign policy in the Middle East failed to totally defang the terrorists. That was always known to be true anyway, whether terrorism, organized terrorism, was behind Benghazi or not. And if there was a spontaneous demonstration touched off by a silly an offensive YouTube posting, then our public diplomacy in the Middle East has failed to the point where a YouTube posting can lead to the deaths of Americans, even respected Americans. So I would say in either case, the Benghazi attack demonstrates that our policies in the Middle East have not been entirely successful. which does not mean that any other policies could have been more successful. It is simply a difficult area, and both our public diplomacy efforts and our efforts to destroy al-Qaeda are still works in process. I look forward to focusing not only on Libya, but on Mali and the Tuareg independence movement there, as misguided as it is for such a small group population-wise to seek independence, and the terrorist exploitation of that. And as the chairman pointed out, we need to focus on the Algerian attacks. We should look at the security situation in Libya and whether the perpetrators of the Benghazi attack will ever be brought to justice by either the Libyan government or American drones, and I yield back.
The Chair will now recognize the Chairman of the Middle East and North African Subcommittee, Ms. Eliana Ross-Layton from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Judge Poe. I'm pleased that both of our subcommittees are convening this important hearing, and I would also like to express my deepest condolences to Michael Lovelady for the loss of his brother, Victor Lovelady, who was killed during the horrendous attack by al-Qaeda-linked terrorists in Algeria earlier this year. Our thoughts and prayers are with you and with your family, as they are with Victor's wife, Maureen, and their 2 children, Aaron and Grant. With growing instability in North Africa, it is necessary to examine the security threats posed by rising extremism and deteriorating stability in the Middle East and North Africa region, how we got there, and where we're going. Sadly, this threat is not new. For nearly 20 years, I have been trying to raise awareness of this very real and growing threat to the United States. In April 1995, I was at the time chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, and I convened a hearing entitled "The Threat of Islamic Extremism in Africa," and stated that Islamic extremism was on the rise and that militant groups posed a growing threat to regional stability, to the fragile democracy in the region, and to U.S. national security interests. April 1995. Almost 2 decades later, not much has changed. The wave of radical Islam continues to spread, and the threat posed by al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other foreign terrorist organizations is due to the establishment of base of operations in North Africa by taking advantage of the lack of security, political will, and the capability of the governments in the region. To illustrate the expansion of narco-terrorism activities in the region, this year we learned that the DEA-led investigation leading to the arrest of individuals connected to Guinea-Bissau and the FARC were indicted for narco-trafficking and terrorism offenses. It is alarming that these individuals indicted were charged with conspiring to sell weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, which could be used against U.S. military personnel in the region. This is why I believe that the DEA should have a larger footprint in North Africa to help dismantle linkages between drug traffickers and terrorist organizations that promote and finance these nefarious activities. However, we cannot concentrate only on the security front. We must also commit resources and attention to help build civil society and strengthen institutions in North Africa. The Arab Spring began in Tunisia with the self-immolation of a disparaged street vendor, and Tunisia was believed to be the most likely to undergo democratic change. Unfortunately, the assassination of one of Tunisia's opposition leader was a detrimental blow to the moderate and secular forces in that country. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood-led government under Morsi failed to demonstrate a commitment to democratic principles and hopes for a truly democratic society that respected human rights. It remains in jeopardy. In Libya, the Obama administration has yet to hold anyone accountable for the terrorist attacks on September 11th. The individuals at the State Department who were responsible for the security failures in Benghazi continue to operate in different capacities without any real consequences, and the terrorist perpetrators who were behind the Benghazi attack are still at large. What is being done to capture them? Prior to the September 11, 2012 attacks in Benghazi, which left 4 brave Americans dead, it was already clear that the security situation in Libya had been far from secure. The administration should have been more aware of these threats and taken the proper steps to increase security measures to ensure the safety of our embassy personnel. They did not. Unfortunately, it is clear that these steps were not taken. We also know that Libya was used as a staging ground for the January 16, 2013 hostage standoff in the gas plant attack in Algeria, which resulted in the deaths of more than 80 people. As Secretary Clinton said when she testified in Congress in January, there is no doubt that the Algerian terrorists had weapons from Libya. There is no doubt that the remnants of AQIM in Mali had weapons from Libya. Yet we seem to not learn from our mistakes as the administration seeks to interject even more arms into the region by arming the Syrian rebels. Our strategy in the region needs to be aimed at disrupting extremist networks and denying safe havens to these groups. However, in order to do that, we must first get a real understanding of the nature of the problem and increase our attention to these threats, because so far we have been woefully lacking in our understanding of these threats, and I think that it is evident in our lack of a coherent foreign policy to these issues. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this timely hearing.
The Chair will now recognize the ranking member of the Middle East North Africa Subcommittee, Mr. Deutsch from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Chairman Ross-Lehtinen, for holding today's hearing. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the threats to U.S. interests and security in North Africa from extremist groups, because that's how we're going to prevent tragedies like Benghazi from occurring again. I hope that we'll uphold the purpose of this hearing rather than furthering baseless political witch hunts. I hope as well that we can use today as an important opportunity to look at ways to better ensure our security and stability in the region. And I hope that today doesn't devolve into another opportunity to try to score political points by suggesting that there was some kind of massive government cover-up or that the administration chose to ignore threats leading up to Benghazi when, as we now know, that's simply untrue. And it doesn't change the fact that 4 courageous Americans died in the attack on Benghazi. The attack on Benghazi was a tragedy perpetuated by terrorists that are fundamentally at odds with everything the United States and our allies stand for. So instead of continuing to lay false blame, I am hopeful that today we will be able to use this hearing to ensure that we're doing everything we can to protect our interests from extremist threats. The spread of extremism in North Africa is of increasing concern as groups like al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb take advantage of political and economic instability and the free flow of weapons and cash. In post-revolutionary Libya, the democratically elected Libyan National Congress remains under constant threat of armed terrorist groups. For the young men in Libya who fought for freedom from Gaddafi's rule, watching a paralyzed government achieve very little really doesn't equate to tangible change in their daily lives. Gaddafi's vast weapons cache is making its way across the region, trickling down to terrorists in Mali and into the hands of extremist fighters in Syria. I'm increasingly concerned that in Egypt's current tenuous political situation, extremists may look for a window of opportunity to broaden support and turn to violence there. AQIM has become quite adept at making a fortune off of kidnappings across North Africa. While AQIM had long been viewed as possessing little threat to the U.S. homeland, it's been emboldened by its increasing numbers and power in the lawless vacuum of post-rebellion states. We have far too many strategic interests in the region, as we saw with the brazen attack on U.S. and other workers in an Algerian gas field earlier this year that left 23 dead. My sincerest condolences to you and your family, Mr. Lovelady, on the loss of your brother. Thank you for being with us today to share his story and your family's story. So how do we combat the growing presence of these extremist elements? We've got to continue to strengthen the state institutions of our allies in North Africa. The Libyan and Tunisian governments are struggling to rebuild. Libya remains without a legitimate and functioning police force to stem the rogue militias operating throughout the country. Libya's oil production is starting to rebound, but there is serious concern over the management of this oil revenue. Tunisia, an economy long dependent on tourism, is slowly beginning to attract foreign investment. A strong economy, increasing education, and job opportunities for youth makes the allure of fighting for AQIM less desirable. But the French intervention in Mali has sparked increasing violence toward Western targets, an al-Qaeda-affiliated group launched a suicide attack on a French uranium mine in Niger in May. And we've got to refocus efforts on border control. Libya's poorly patrolled southern border is a gateway for Islamic extremists into Mali, Niger, and Chad. And without a strong national army or security force, Libya is relying on various militias to patrol the border. Weapons flow freely from Sudan into Egypt and into the hands of Hamas and al-Qaeda affiliates in the Arabian Peninsula. I'm heartened by the announcement in May that Libya, Sudan, and Egypt agreed to work together to develop the border triangle and to establish free trade zones that would help improve the economic lives of those living in that area. A lack of basic infrastructure has stunted economic development in many areas of the Sahara. U.S. investment in roads and electrical grids will help shore up these underdeveloped areas. And with much of our attention focused on Syria, Egypt, and the threat of Hezbollah and Iran, we cannot allow North Africa to become a terrorist Wild West. Strong support from the U.S. and our allies for counterterrorism cooperation through programs like the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership is an interagency partnership that focuses on improving individual country and regional capabilities in the Sahel and the Maghreb to defeat terrorist organizations. Focusing on that is a must. Active cooperation on border control and intelligence sharing can restrict the movement and diminish the presence of these terrorist groups. I appreciate the witnesses being here today, and I look forward to continuing this discussion with all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Florida. We now recognize other members for 1 minute who have an opening statement. Mr. Shabbat from Ohio, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Libya is an example of what you get when the United States leads from behind. And there's a saying that nature abhors a vacuum, and that's what we had in Libya after this conflict took place. And the United States was leading from behind in the conflict itself, but then especially after the war was over, we now see jihadists exercising considerable power there. We've seen 4 brave Americans killed, and it's just, it's a tragedy, and we all express our sympathy to the Lovelady family. It's a horrible thing. Unfortunately, I think we saw the same thing in Iraq, where we saw, you talk about seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. We basically had a country stabilized, a potential ally. There was always a plan to leave troops there. We've pulled troops out. The country's now coming apart at the seams, and we're going to see that repeated in Afghanistan, I'm afraid. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair will now recognize Mr. Snyder from Illinois for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today, and to the Lovelady family, please accept my sincerest condolences as well. Following the end of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, we have observed a weak central government which has been relatively unable to police vast swaths of territory within the country. This has resulted in a proliferation of militant groups carving out areas of influence and protection, a situation which does not generally contribute positively to the goals of the central government. Personally, I am extremely concerned with the rise of groups such as Ansar al-Sharia and their growing influence across the Islamic Maghreb. I am also concerned that portions of Libya may be used as training grounds for foreign fighters and a conduit for transporting weapons and equipment to terrorist organizations, not only in North Africa, but also throughout the Middle East. Mr. Zelin, you mentioned in your prepared remarks that one of the worst-kept secrets locally, but only reported on within the past month, is the large amount of weapons that Libyans have sent to Syria via Benghazi and Misrata through Lebanon and Turkey. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and the thoughts of the panel on how we can address these potential regional destabilizing efforts by groups affiliated with al-Qaeda. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Chair will now recognize Mr. Yoho from Florida for 1 minute.
I thank the chairs and ranking members for holding this hearing today. The fact that we still have not brought to justice those who attacked us is a travesty. Terrorists have spilled American bloods, and we must do everything we can to bring the perpetrators to justice. As famously said, justice delayed is justice denied. And I give my regards to Mr. Lovelady and your family on the loss of your brother and son, and all others who have lost loved ones in a cowardly attack against the United States and its citizens. And I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today, and I thank you for being here. I yield back.
Does any other member wish to make an opening statement? I'll now proceed with the introduction of our four witnesses, and then they will testify. A brief introduction of each. Mr. Gartenstein Ross is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He studies challenges posed by violent non-state actors. He is the author of our volume editor of 12 books, and including Bin Laden's Legacy, and is published widely in the popular and academic press. Mr. Aaron Zelin is the Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. His research focuses on how jihadist groups are adjusting to the new political environment of the Arab uprisings and politics in countries transitioning into democracy. Mr. Zelin also maintains a website, jihadology.net, which is an archive for jihadid primary source materials. Dr. Daniel Byman is a professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and the research director of the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Byman has served as a professional staff member with both the 9/11 Commission and the joint 9/11 inquiry staff of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. He's worked as a research director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy and the RAND Corporation as an analyst of the Middle East for the United States intelligence community. Mike Lovelady, born in Port Arthur, Texas, that's southeast Texas, was a firefighter for the city of Nederland for over 30 years. He's been married for 35 years to his wife, Wanda, and has 3 children, Kevin, Jason, and Ashley. His brother, Victor Lovelady, and Victor's widow and wife, Maureen, is here today as well. Victor Lovelady was killed by terrorists who attacked the gas plant where he was working in Algeria in January of this year. I want to thank all 4 of the witnesses for being here. The Chair would recognize each of you for 5 minutes. Keep your testimony to 5 minutes, or you may get gavelled, and you'll find out what that means if you don't figure it out. So after each witness testifies, then the people on both subcommittees will ask questions. First, we'll hear from Mr. Gartenstein Ross for 5 minutes.
Chairman Poe and Ross-Lehtinen, Ranking Members Sherman and Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittees, it's an honor to appear before you today to discuss the threat of jihadist terrorism in North Africa. In my view, the most important facet of understanding the regional threat is how the Arab uprisings have fundamentally changed the shape of jihadism. Al-Qaeda and other like-minded militants possess a defined regional strategy that began to take shape even as Hosni Mubarak's regime was drawing its very last breaths. The rough consensus that jihadist strategists reached about developments produced some simple principles for action on their part. These strategists agreed that the political upheaval helped their movement in several ways. One of the most significant was that they foresaw unprecedented opportunities to undertake dawah, or missionary work, to propagate their particularized version of the Islamic faith. The new and democratically elected regimes would be less likely to suppress jihadist groups' dawah efforts so long as they didn't explicitly engage in violence against the state. And indeed, in this new environment, groups like Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia have been quite effective at expanding both their numbers and influence. That being said, the jihadist movement, as we all know, has never been satisfied with constraining itself to nonviolent advocacy. Some of their post-uprisings militant activity in countries like Tunisia and Egypt has taken the form of vigilante violence aimed at such perceived foes of the movement as artists, civil society activists, educators, and also religious minorities. But another aspect of their work has involved jihad, which these groups understand as warfare against other competitors for power. There's currently a mutually reinforcing interaction between countries in the region in which jihadists are primarily engaged in dawah, countries like Tunisia and Egypt, and those where a weak or disintegrating state makes violence more feasible, in places like Libya or Mali. The fact that jihadist groups currently engaged in dawah efforts have not given up on using violence to eventually seize power makes a regional approach important to them. Having steep variations in how these groups relate to violence allows groups like Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia or Egypt's Salafi jihadist groups to propagate their ideology, but at the same time to refrain from the kind of large-scale involvement in either violence or preparations for violence that could trigger a state crackdown. At the same time, these groups can also take advantage of regional developments to quietly arm themselves and also undertake militant training. So I'd like to note how Libya, in particular, fits into the broader regional picture. The fact that Libya's central government is incredibly weak and the country increasingly chaotic at this point cannot be denied by any reasonable observer. Militant groups have taken advantage of this environment. One way is training, with camps operating in southern Libya. The impact of these camps can be seen, for example, in the tragic January attack at the In Amenas gas complex in Algeria. Some of the attackers reportedly trained in Libya before undertaking that attack. In addition, they also used Libyan soil as a staging ground before undertaking that attack. Al-Qaeda emir Ayman al-Zawahiri has also established connections to militant camps in Libya, which, for example, include training for suicide missions. A second issue is the flow of arms to neighboring countries, as Chairman Ross-Lehtinen pointed to. Libyan arms have played a role in the Malian conflict. They played a role in the In Amenas attack in Algeria, and they've also been moved across Algeria into Tunisia, where they've helped strengthen Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia. Right now, we're also focused on Egypt, and Libyan arms have poured into Egypt's North Sinai, which has seen, over the past few days, an escalation in attacks on security forces following the ouster of Mohamed Morsi. A third issue is how Libya can serve as a safe haven. Following the French intervention in Mali, fighters from Ansar al-Din and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb made their way into southwest Libya, where they blended with local militant groups. This is also an important part of the jihadist regional strategy. Rather than standing and fighting, the militants who were occupying North Mali melted away. Such a tactic helps to keep the movement's capabilities alive and prevent significant attrition. Overall, the relationship between countries where dawah is the predominant strategy and countries where violence is dominant is vital to understanding the threat on a regional scale. The region should be understood as a whole, and countries where violence is more feasible can also make violence more likely in places where dawah is predominant. A very dangerous game is currently being played in Egypt, and if that situation escalates, look for Libya to be an increasingly important part of that dynamic. The jihadist regional strategy overall is coherent. The U.S. doesn't have to be at the forefront of a response. Over the past few years, we've seen partner nations take the lead against militant groups, and it's sensible for the U.S. to minimize its expenditure when feasible and wise. But we should understand that jihadist strategy is designed for the long term, rather than tricking ourselves into thinking that these groups will inevitably moderate. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. 5 minutes from Mr. Zelin. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mrs. Chairman and members of the two subcommittees for giving me the opportunity to testify today on the threat emanating from Libya. I'll be summarizing my written testimony. Currently, one can identify three interrelated but unique threats within Libya. One that is local with Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, one that is regional with Libyans going to fight in Syria, and the third is transnational related to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. I'll be focusing on the first two since my colleague David just spoke about AQIM. Before discussing this, it's important to note that Libya has all types of violence, and most is actually not related to jihadi organizations or those sympathetic to them. A large portion of it is militia-based, a legacy of the revolution against the Gaddafi regime, and related to local economic or political grievances. This should be kept in mind when contextualizing jihadi violence within the broader picture of Libya. So Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, it's an organization that was established in February 2012, and it's steadily grown over time over the last year and a half. We've been able to see this based off of the two annual conferences they held. At the first one in June 2012, there were less than 1,000 individuals that were present, but the one that occurred 2 weeks ago, there were more than 2,000 individuals. So what explains this? Dawah, as David mentioned, missionary work, has been at the forefront of their activities within Benghazi, cleaning streets, holding lectures, opening up medical clinics. But their most successful actions have been their anti-drug campaign within Benghazi, and it's actually gotten local buy-in from the psych ward in Benghazi, the local soccer club, the telecommunications company, as well as other actors there. And it's also allowed them to expand their operations outside of Benghazi for the first time with one event and lecture in Tripoli in the capital. This also highlights the false narrative that was heard in the media following the attack last year that they were essentially kicked out of the city. This is not true. They were just kicked out of the base that they're in, but the members of the organization stayed within Benghazi, and within a few days after the attack, you actually heard doctors and nurses at the hospital that they had been guarding that they wanted them back there to help out. In addition, we also see growth in terms of their connections with some tribesmen in the southern city of Ubari, as well as the fact that they opened up a second branch of the organization just 1 week ago in the city of Sirte. On a regional level, we see Libyans going over in droves to Syria right now to fight against the Assad regime, and Libyan nationals are actually the largest number of foreign nationals fighting in Syria against the regime, as well as the largest number of foreign nationals who have died. And the worry is what happens when they go home? Is it going to be a repeat of what we saw in the 1980s in the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan, when you saw Libyans going home and then going to fight against the government there? The difference now, though, is unlike in the 1990s, the central government is very weak. We could see this with the different militia groups being able to blackmail the central government in terms of legislation, in terms of individuals in different ministries. Additionally, even though there have been attempts to integrate militias into the police force and military, because of the way Gaddafi ruled, we saw there are potential issues because of regionalism and localism there. So let's say you have somebody from Zintan trying to do a police work in Darna. There might be potential issues there because of this sort of localized xenophobia in some respects. So what can the United States and its allies do? I think one of the things is we can't just be holed up in embassies and staying in the capital. We need to have individuals go out to the cities, get in touch with the local businessmen, the local civil society actors, as well as even the local militiamen, to better understand the mosaic in these local communities. Another area where the United States can help out is promoting entrepreneurship. This is what America does best, and it's also a way to combat against the community organizing that groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Libya do, since we should be using globalization to our advantage just as they do. A third aspect is that we should continue our robust intelligence gathering with our local and regional allies, as well as our allies in Western Europe, who are a lot closer to this. And finally, I think one of the things that should be on the table, as long as it's okay with the Libyan government, is that we should think about potentially using drones in southern Libya on the training camps of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. This, of course, could be controversial just because of the debate on drones, but I think it is important. But I would advise against using it in the north, east, and west of the country where there are larger population centers, but using it in the south could be legitimate since it's sparsely populated, so collateral damage could potentially be low, and the fact that that's where AQIM is hosting its training camps. Thank you very much.
Recognize you for 5 minutes.
Chairman Poe, Chairman Ross-Leighton, and Ranking Member Sherman and Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. I am humbled to be here on the panel with Michael Lovelady. Please know that my thoughts go out to him, his family, and the other relatives of those Americans who have died in Algeria and from other terrorist attacks. There is a bit of good news, which is that the al-Qaeda core is weaker, in part due to the American drone campaign. But the bad news is that affiliate groups like al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or groups or individuals that have no formal relationship with al-Qaeda but share many of its goals, are filling the void. They are taking advantage of greater state weakness in the Middle East, which is likely to increase in the years to come. We have seen terrorism spread to new areas since the Arab Spring, and several African countries have also become more dangerous. In recent weeks, Egypt has become markedly less stable, so similar plots in chaotic areas are likely to be in our future. The only strong regime in the North Africa region is Algeria, and the United States has at best a lukewarm relationship with the Algerian government. Algerians are at the core of AQIM, and the Algerian government runs the most extensive spy network in the region. So we must look to Algeria to get at both the problem and the solution. However, the Algerian government has a history of manipulating opposition groups, including violent terrorist groups, making it difficult to trust the information it provides. I believe that the U.S. reaction to the Benghazi attack may leave us less prepared for terrorism in the future. During my time as a staff member of the 9/11 Commission and for the House and Senate Joint Committee investigating 9/11, we consistently pushed for a CIA and a State Department that were more expeditionary and willing to take risks. In short, we wanted more people with the courage, experience, skill, and mindset of Ambassador Stevens. His loss was a great tragedy for our country. Unfortunately, the political and bureaucratic lesson of Benghazi is clear. Avoid taking risks at all costs. American diplomats will be more confined to well-guarded parts of capital cities and more removed from local populations. This will keep them safer, but U.S. intelligence is likely to decline and U.S. statecraft to diminish. Better intelligence and good relations are important for keeping Americans safe in different parts of the world and in the U.S. homeland. It is impossible to quantify the benefits derived, but better intelligence allows numerous plots to be disrupted, and better relations reduces hostility to the United States and improves cooperation when trying to disrupt attacks or manage their consequences. Trying to improve intelligence and relations, however, will put those Americans charged with gathering intelligence and those State Department officials charged with improving relations at more risk. The United States should bolster, not draw down, its presence in North Africa. America has important interests in the region, and in any case, the threats will not disappear simply because the United States chooses to ignore them. Jihadists may point to any U.S. retreat after Benghazi as proof of U.S. cowardice. The region is now a growing arena for jihadists, and the size of their area of operation is growing. In addition, jihadists from the region, as well as weapons from Libya, are showing up in places like Syria and Sinai, and here I commend a recent report authored by my colleague here, Mr. Zelin. In short, the region's problems are no longer regional. We should seek to understand and engage regional governments to counter the threats that emanate from North Africa. To this end, we need a robust intelligence and diplomatic presence, even in dangerous countries or ones that suffer from governments that reject democratic practices. Because the operating environment is risky, the United States should augment and systematize its rapid response capabilities and post-attack procedures. The United States must also work more with allies like France to prepare for contingencies. In addition, U.S. bureaucracy should adopt a more regional response to the terrorism threat. Unfortunately, U.S. bureaucracies still face difficulty working in a regional way. Finally, it is particularly important to hedge as we expand ties to undemocratic regimes. This involves expanding the range of American contacts across government and society and trying to find alternative solutions to dependence on troubling countries like Algeria. Such hedging allows the United States to protect its interests, yet make clear to regime figures that the United States is not completely dependent on them. This both makes U.S. pressure more credible and leaves the United States in a better position to deal with the aftermath of revolution. Thank you again for this opportunity to present my views.
Mr. Lovelady, for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Poe, for the opportunity and the rest of the committee members to come testify on behalf of my brother. I've just got a story I put together on how this went down, and I think it'd be very, very helpful for you to understand the hurt that my family feels. On the morning of January 16, 2013, at approximately 3:30 a.m., my home phone rang. As usual, a call at this time of the morning does not bring good news. When my wife answered the phone, a strange voice asked, "Who's speaking?" When my wife refused to give her name, she heard Victor state, "Wanda, I'm in trouble. I need Mike." When I answered the phone, Victor stated, "I am in trouble. I have been captured by Al-Qaeda, and we are tied up." Then Victor asked me to tell his wife, Maureen, about his situation in person because he did not want her to be alone when she got the news about him. Victor then said, "You will know what to do." I told him that I would notify his wife, contact the FBI and the U.S. State Department. I attempted to ask questions about his situation, but he stated that the captors were next to him and he could not answer any questions. Then we told each other bye. That was the last I've ever heard from my brother. Victor was only 57 years old and my only sibling. Victor and I grew up in Nederland, Texas, with wonderful parents that raised us with traditional and solid values that would help us throughout our lives. We were the type of family that did everything together, such as going to the beach or the lake. As we grew up and went in different career paths, we did not get to see each other as much as I would have liked. However, we still talked on the phone a lot. I always considered Victor the genius of the family. I admired his ingenuity, and I was in awe of his knowledge about electricity and electronics. Victor had 2 degrees from Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. His Bachelor of Science was in Industrial Engineering, and his associate degree was in Electricity and Electronics. Victor was a great brother, husband, and father. Victor married to his wife Maureen for 33 years. He had 2 children he loved so much, Aaron, 28, and Grant, 21 years old. At this time, I'd like to introduce Victor's wife, Maureen. Oh, you stand up? His son, Grant, and my family, Wanda's my wife, my children, Kevin, Jason, and Ashley. His daughter Erin would have liked to have been here today, but she had to have emergency back surgery this past Saturday. Victor had a heart of gold and would do anything for anyone, especially the elderly. He was a kind and gentle man. Victor was an industrial engineer by trade and designed system buildings to control industry operations. He was also a master electrician, could almost do anything. Most of Victor's life was spent in Nederland, only recently moving to Houston after his children graduated from Nederland High School. When work in our area slowed down, Victor traveled back and forth to Houston, a 170-mile round trip for about 3 years so his children could graduate from Nederland High School. His son Grant was a star football player, and his daughter Erin was assistant softball coach at Nederland High School. Victor never had a pension plan and always had to pay his family's insurance with no input from the company he worked for. He never had more than 2 weeks off in a year. However, he longed to be able to retire and spend more time with his wife and children while he was still a relatively young man. When the opportunity came up for Victor to go to work overseas, Victor weighed the pros and the cons. He was told that he could only work overseas until he was 60 years old. He knew that if he could do this job for 3 years, he would be able to make enough money to retire and be with his family. He was assured that it was a safe place to work. He told his family and me that he would be safe. He said the plant was in the middle of the desert and no one would go there. After speaking with my brother, I called the State Department's Washington number to see if they could provide me with more information about his situation. After explaining to them that I just received a call from Victor, they said they would look into the matter and call me back. The State Department called me back later that morning to confirm that there was an attack on the plant. I continued to see regular calls from both the State Department and the FBI after that. They kept us well informed of Victor's situation on a daily basis and were very respectful. In addition to that, we were visited by agents from New York, Beaumont, and the New York City offices. On January the 19th, the FBI came to a family member's house where we had gathered and told us that Victor had died on January 17th. On January 21st at 3 a.m., the State Department and FBI called again, asking if there was any identifying marks that could be used to identify Victor. I told them that Victor had a tattoo of a lightning bolt on his upper left arm. Half hour later, they called me back and confirmed that they had positively identified his body. About 2 months later, in March, we got more details of Victor's death. The FBI Special Agent Jessica Ulmer informed us that Victor was killed as the hostages were being moved from one side of the compound to the other, and the Algerian forces had launched a raid. I don't know if the Algerian forces took out the cars or the terrorists blew up the vehicles, but Victor's cause of death was listed as blast injuries. Agent Ulmer has kept in contact with me over the last few months regarding Victor's personal effects that we hope to recover. Jessica is a compassionate agent that works hard to complete a task such as this investigation and truly understands the feeling of our family regarding our loss. I personally want to thank Congressman Ted Poe and his staff for their care and diligence on having Victor's personal effects returned from Algeria. Congressman Poe never forgot our family and continues to seek justice for the people that lost their lives on that fateful day. Congressman Poe is a true patriot, and he makes me proud to be from Texas. I also want to thank Congressman Randy Weber for making sure our every need was met throughout this entire ordeal. Finally, on behalf of the Lovelady, Battaccio, and Rowan families, I want to thank Congressman Poe, Congressman Weber, and all the House Committee on Foreign Affairs members for continuing to fight terrorism in keeping Americans safe and at home. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lovelady, and once again, on behalf of both the committees that are here, we want to extend our sympathy to you, Maureen, and the families of Victor. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, and then we will proceed through each committee member. I want to start with the basics regarding both Benghazi and the attack in Algeria. Did we know before the attack in Benghazi? Did we know before the attack in Algeria that it was going to occur? After the attacks are over with, do we know who committed the attack in Benghazi and Algeria? If we do know, where are those people that committed those attacks? So those are 3 questions, and I'll throw that out to all of the committee members. Mr. Bynum, you want to start first?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should stress that my knowledge of this comes from unclassified sources, and I'm sure much of value is in the classified realm. My understanding, certainly of the Benghazi attack, was that it was widely known that it was a very dangerous threat environment before the attack. In terms of the specifics of the plot, to my knowledge, that was not anticipated by the U.S. government from almost everything I've seen, including the reported actions of Ambassador Stevens. In Algeria, I believe it slightly differently. Algeria, including the energy sector, had historically been a relatively safe area. Now, we need several caveats when we say that, because Algeria itself has had huge terrorism problems, especially in the 1990s. Another thing to remark on is Algeria's role, albeit limited, in supporting the French effort in Mali.
Excuse me, Dr. Bynum, can you cut to the chase? Mm-hmm. Did we know about the attack in Algeria before it occurred? I'm talking about the United States. And the second question is, do we know who committed it? And if so, have those people been apprehended? That's the 3 questions regarding both places, since the time is limited.
I would say in Algeria, sir, that we knew there was a dangerous threat environment, but again, did not anticipate the attack. Afterwards, we know some of the individuals involved, to my knowledge, but I don't believe we know all of them. There is still some uncertainty, and to my knowledge, they have not been apprehended.
Mr. Zelin, you want to weigh in on those 3 questions?
Sure. In both cases, I'm unsure that the U.S. government was aware that they were going to occur at that specific time. In terms of who did what in Benghazi, there was a statement put out by Ansar al-Sharia in Libya within about 12 hours of the attack saying that they themselves did not order anything, but the way it was worded suggested that members of the group were involved. So it could have been some type of freelancing. And then in terms of the Inaminus attack, Mukhtar Belmukhtar's group claimed responsibility for it, and it's believed that some of the members in his group with him were a part of it. And currently, it's believed that Mukhtar Belmukhtar is either in northern Niger or in southern Libya, but unsure. And then the members of Ansar al-Sharia are still in Benghazi.
So has anybody in either attack been apprehended, to your knowledge?
I'm not aware of that. And in the case of Mukhtar Belmukhtar, we've seen that he's conducted other operations in northern Niger a couple of months ago, or maybe a month ago.
Mr. Gartenstein.
So as to preserve your time, Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything to add to my colleagues. I agree with them.
You made a comment, Dr. Bynum, that kind of irritated me, in that you said that the terrorists in North Africa look at the United States policy since both of these actions, Algeria and then first Benghazi, as a retreat from the area, and that the United States, if I got your comments correctly, has cowardice regarding this issue. So that irritates me. You want to explain that word cowardice and what you mean by that?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for irritating you.
No, it's okay. It's not the first time.
First time I've done it, I hope. Sir, in the past, bin Laden would point specifically to the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon, and also to Somalia, as proof that if you hit the United States hard, it will leave a country. In Benghazi, in particular, my fear is that if what happened in Benghazi leads to a drawdown of the broader U.S. diplomatic and intelligence presence in North Africa, that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll be hearing Benghazi added to this list. And it's a way of encouraging his followers, sir, that he says that hit the United States and they run. I hope that's not so, sir.
My last question to all of you, do any of you know of the, whether it's true or not that regarding Algeria that the United States had forces in the general area before the attack and right after the attack?
I have no knowledge of that, sir.
Mr. Zelin?
Neither do I.
Dr. Byman?
Nor I, sir.
And lastly, Mr. Lovelady, do you have any other thing that your brother Victor told you that you haven't already told us before he was killed in the plant in Algeria?
No, sir, I don't. I just do pretty much, so I spoke with him very little. And the information I've got was from the FBI on how he died and what was happening when he died.
And he told you he was already captured by what group or what?
He told me he was captured by Al-Qaeda.
All right. Thank you very much. 5 minutes for the ranking member, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Lovelady, thank you for your testimony, and I'd like to thank your entire family for being here to put a human face on what we're talking about. There are those who blame America anytime anything bad happens anywhere in the world, that we're the world homogen, and that therefore anything bad that happens is a sign of American weakness or American error. The fact of the matter is, with some crises, we need to watch and not get involved. With some, we need to influence and put only some of our prestige, money, and in some cases, troops on the line. And only in a very few cases do we need to actually be sure to control the outcome and assume ownership of the crisis and make a full commitment. We should not retreat from all involvement in the world, nor should we try to take responsibility for the outcome of any crisis. The phrase lead from behind has been disparaged, and as a turn of phrase it deserves to be disparaged, but as a concept, that is to say, be involved but not necessarily take the leadership role, it has to play a role in American foreign policy. In Niger, we helped France, but France took the lead. Would we have had it any other way? Is there anyone in this room that wants American troops in Niger? And in Libya, it was a combination of the United States, NATO, and the rebels on the ground that overthrew Gaddafi. We did not put our troops on the ground or try to control the outcome. We got an outcome that was far from perfect. Would we have preferred to see American troops dominate Libya? There is also the Pottery Barn rule put forward by Colin Powell that says if we do get involved, we have to take ownership and we're responsible for rebuilding. I'll point out that history proves that wrong. In World War I, we played a critical role in breaking the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. No one in America dreamed that we had the responsibility to rebuild or that we owned that which had been broken. And while some of our more imperialist friends who were with us in World War I took advantage of opportunities, no one asserted that they had the obligation to rebuild every society that was destroyed. We have a right to defend ourselves without assuming the obligation to make sure that every country that harbors terrorists ends up as prosperous and as democratic as our World War II adversaries. And we have to be humble enough to realize that sometimes we will influence but not control. Now I'd like to turn our attention to Morocco, which is one area we haven't focused on yet. I'm concerned that the AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, has reportedly established ties with the Polisario militants in Algeria. Algeria provides material support and land for the Polisario, and some of the members seem to have been involved in the terrorist operations in northern Mali. I don't know which of our experts to ask, but what are the links between AQIM and the Polisario? What are we doing to disrupt those links? And what should we be doing to help allies like Morocco deal with AQMD-aided organizations?
Based off of what I know in the open source reporting, it appears that there's a lot of rumors related to potential connections, but there's no hard evidence as of now, at least based off the open source reporting. And in terms of any connections at all, I would assume that our allies in Morocco would help out in arresting individuals, as the Moroccans have in other cases where there have been different terrorist cells within Morocco that we've seen over the past 10 years.
Well, the Polisario is being sheltered by Algeria. What do we do? What should we do there?
I don't really focus on Algeria that much in terms of my research, so I don't know the nature of what the United States' relations there, but I assume that the United States can speak with Algeria, but we also have to understand in this context that there is a rivalry between Morocco and Algeria, and we can't necessarily, influence it that much.
I'm going to try to sneak in one more question. Is Libya, we turned over tens of billions of dollars of Gaddafi's reserves to the Libyan government. Is that money being used to establish security on the ground? Is it being hoarded, or is it being stolen? Anybody have a one-word answer?
I would say primarily hoarded and stolen, but a portion of it is being used to try to develop some governance, but not enough, sir.
I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the chairman of the Middle East North Africa Subcommittee, Ms. Ross Layton from Florida.
Thank you, Judge
5
Poe.
minutes.
The threat of radical Islam, as we all know, is not a new phenomenon. We know that the problem is not just localized in one country, spread across an entire region. Radical Islamic militants are opportunists. They seek out areas of weak governance to establish base of operation, and from there they go out and wage war against anyone who doesn't comport to their interpretation of Islam. And since the Arab Spring, we've seen this opportunistic wave of Islamic militants move across the region from Libya to Tunisia to Algeria to Mali and beyond. And now we're seeing thousands of radical Islamist and al-Qaeda-linked terrorists flocking to Syria to join the fight there. If and when Assad falls and the Islamists manage to control Syria, what further implications would that have for the rest of the region, and what can the U.S. do to prevent an even further spread of this Islamist wave? And when looking at the administration's policy when it comes to this region, it's difficult to define any clear or decisive agenda. In order to tackle this problem, it's imperative that we support our African partners' efforts to disrupt the operations of terrorist networks, deny safe havens to extremist groups, prevent an escalation of emerging threats through greater mutual cooperation and constant vigilance. So, Dr. Byman, I'd like to ask you, in your testimony you state that North Africa and the Sahel tend to be separate bureaucratically, even though many of their problems are linked. How effective can programs like the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership be in bolstering our partners in the region and fighting these threats if funded and run properly? And what governments, whether it's local or national, can the United States work with in this region? Where have we seen any host nation buy in on these issues? And Mr. Zelin, yesterday the British Defense Ministry announced that it would train up to 2,000 Libyan troops, which is part of a broader package of defense and security assistance developed with the U.S., with France, and Italy. In your testimony, you state that the U.S. should work with regional and Western European allies. Will this help stabilize the deteriorating situation in Libya? Should the U.S. do more to help the Libyan government? Dr. Byman.
The regional versus state-focused issue is a very difficult one for any bureaucracy. Almost any approach you take is going to have problems one way or another. But when you do something cross-regional, having state-focused bureaucracies makes it far more difficult. You're going to have, each ambassador is going to have his or her own little fiefdom that is operating in a different way. You're going to have analysts not talk to one another. You're going to have programs that are implemented in different ways. And unfortunately, at times, the bad guys are more regional than we are. And
I think that the steps that the UK is taking with training Libyan troops is a great idea. I think it should be done in addition to whatever else the United States is doing and our allies in Western Europe. But as I mentioned, I think we have to be careful also about the regionalism that we do see in Libya and the potential strife that could happen if you have individuals from different parts of the country trying to secure other parts. So that's something to think about as well.
Thank you. Mr. Gartenstein-Ross?
I'll speak to the initial point that you made about Syria. I think that at the end of the day, jihadists will not control Syria, but they'll control enough territory and have enough influence that it's going to create a lot of problems within the region. I would specifically look at the interplay between Syria and the developing situation in both Egypt and also Iraq. In terms of what we can do, I think that there's three things that we can do right now. One is I do support engagement with Syrian factions in order to both map the factions and also to gain influence with whomever ends up being the eventual winner. But I think it's extremely important, and you already pointed to the dangers of arming Syrian factions. There's been some talk of sending them anti-tank weapons or anti-aircraft weaponry. I think especially given that groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which are linked to al-Qaeda, have not been shunned by other Syrian factions, and also that we can't control the flow of this weaponry, we absolutely should not undertake it, in that it will be used against the United States or else our allies.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Poe, and our deepest condolences to the entire Lovelady family. Thank you.
Chair, recognize the gentleman from Florida, the ranking member of the Middle East African Subcommittee, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some questions, but for the panel. But first, Mr. Lovelady, there are a lot of discussions that take place here that are, suffice to say, dry, sometimes uninteresting to people who happen to pay attention to what we do. There are not enough opportunities for the members of this committee, and I would suggest not enough opportunities, I think, unfortunately, too often for the American people to be reminded of why what we do here really matters so much. And your being here today with your wife, Wanda, and your kids, and Maureen, you being here with Grant, really does remind us of that. When Victor, when your brother was killed in the middle, as you put it, in the middle of the desert in Algeria, this matters to us, and this matters to this country, and the battle that we have against terror and our fight against terrorists in what for many is seen as some remote part of the world is all the more important when we are reminded of the impact that this has on people's lives here in this country. So we do offer our condolences, but I also want to offer our profound thanks. It's not, I am quite certain, it's not something that you ever thought that you would do, to come to testify at the United States House of Representatives. It means a lot to us. I appreciate your being here, and to your family, and Maureen and Grant, thank you very much for being here. I hope that, I know that we've taken something significant from your presence here, and if you would pass our condolences to Erin, I hope her surgery went well also. Now, Dr. Byman, if you could speak to your assessment of al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and specifically chain of command issues, cooperation, how structured is it? Or are we just talking about hundreds of offshoot extremist groups that are loosely affiliated with these principles?
It is an organization that is less structured than the other al-Qaeda affiliates. There are a few main branchings, but a lot of divisions within, and then divisions within the divisions.
And And you focused on Algeria in your testimony, Dr. Byman. How do we encourage Morocco and Algeria, as North Africa's two most stable countries, to not only work together on greater intelligence, but how do we encourage them to take the lead on these issues?
The good news is Morocco is already a very close American partner on counterterrorism issues. Algeria is extremely tricky. There's a history of suspicion, and it's really an intelligence-led regime in a very nasty way. This requires to me a much greater awareness on the U.S. part of the different players in Algeria, U.S. efforts to cultivate different parts of the regime, especially as a transition is possible there, regular pressure, and also high-level pressure. But all that said, much of that will only get us so far, and we may have to live with what's going to be a very uneasy relationship.
And Mr. Zelin, should the United States be providing greater training on counterterrorism border control? The French had offered to send 100 military trainers to help the Libyans. Should the U.S. be more involved in that as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think the U.S., France, the U.K., and some of our other allies who have been dealing with some of these issues over the past decade or so have a lot of experience in how to deal with some of these problems in different countries. And the fact that, especially the French, they have a lot of connections with North Africa and the Sahel region from historically, so they have a good cultural understanding and a lot of the different players in the region too, so they can maybe help take a lead in this, but we can also augment it based off of our own expertise in these types of trainings.
I appreciate it. And Mr. Chairman, before you'll back up, Michael, I think I inadvertently confused your and Victor's names. I just let me clarify that we're moved by your presence here, and to you and the family. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Florida. The Chair will recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Loveladies, thank you all for being here. I appreciate you guys. Dr. Byman, I think it was you who said maybe Algeria had the best spy network. Was that you?
Yes, it was, sir.
Could you elaborate on
that? The Algerian state has been an intelligence and military state for several decades now. And because they faced a massive civil war and Islamist uprising in the 1990s, they had to develop very good sources and networks simply to survive. And so since many of the groups they were fighting or individuals were regional, their networks became regional. And also, I will say in a very nasty way, they were trained by the Soviets. And in the Soviet approach, in order to defeat the opposition, you become the opposition. So they brought a lot of groups under the government's banner, directly or indirectly, and as a result, were able to manipulate and control them, and gave them extensive intelligence and influence over the opposition, but also implicated the government in several of the jihadists' worst attacks as well.
So would you say that extends to al-Qaeda and the jihadists and forces outside of Algeria, that they would have extensive knowledge about those groups?
Yes, I would.
Is it safe to say then, in your opinion, that perhaps they might have had information about this attack before it occurred on the BP plant in Algeria?
I believe the answer is no. The attack on the Algerian plant was quite bad for the Algerian government in the sense of its most important resource and its reputation. So I think they would have tried to stop that had they known about it.
So you've obviously been involved and you've been studying this group for a while, this country. So it's your opinion that had they known, then they would have taken the necessary steps to stop it, or would they have notified us?
I believe they would have taken the necessary steps to stop it, and there's a good chance they would not have notified us because they prefer to keep many of these things secret.
You don't think they would have enlisted our aid or notified the BP? They would have just intervened militarily to stop the attack itself?
I think that they believe they could handle it themselves. They believe they've handled worse in the past, and that they don't need superpower support.
So they would have been willing to spill blood to protect American, foreign workers on their soil?
I think they would phrase it as, we're willing to spill blood to kill terrorists who are going after Algeria's natural resources. The presence of foreigners, I don't think, mattered terribly to them.
Okay. Don't turn your mic off. I'm not done with you. I think you also named the gentleman who may have been instrumental in this, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
The al-Qaeda leader, yes, sir.
Okay. And we know where he is. We've seen him at different places, put it that way.
Sir, Ayman al-Zawahiri is the al-Qaeda leader in Pakistan who
Okay.
I don't think we know where he is.
Okay. Is it your professional opinion, since you study this stuff and keep up with it, maybe we ought to assign one drone to him?
I think right now, sir, there are many drones with his name on it. I just don't think we can find them.
Were you the one in earlier testimony that mentioned the use of drones, or was that?
That was me, sir.
Okay. Do you think so you're saying that you don't believe that the Algerian government saw this coming? So in essence, does that serve to vindicate our own State Department in not only Algeria but in Benghazi, that maybe they couldn't have seen it coming, or do you think the State Department should have seen the attack in Benghazi coming?
I would say that they should have known it was a much higher risk environment than what they prepared for. I think anticipating any specific attack is going to be exceptionally difficult, but I think that the risk environment was treated as lower than they should have treated it.
Would you compare that to other areas that we have embassies in, for example, Syria or any of the other Middle Eastern states? Where would you have put Benghazi on that list?
I would say, well, near the top in terms of danger, sir.
So when there was a request for more security, then that should have been heeded very seriously.
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there a way, to your knowledge, and I agree with my colleague, Mr. Poe, when he says what's been done, is there a way for us to track the movement of these forces, these terrorists, short of just a satellite assigned to them?
Part of it depends on cultivating local sources. Part of it is identifying their communications methods. That's often the best way. And so what you want is a mix of methods. Often the local governments have the best information, and that may be the government of Algeria, or in some cases it may be sub-state groups, and you want to work with them as well.
Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Just a point of clarification there, Dr. Byman, is it Algeria's policy when it comes to terrorists just to go in with guns blazing? I mean, is that really their policy?
They do a variety of things. They will try to arrest and disrupt in advance. They will try at times to co-opt people they can co-opt. They've at times bribed them to go in different directions, and at times they've killed them in large numbers. So it's a mixer.
Thank you. Chair will recognize my good friend and chief irritant from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just a paid advertisement before my time gets started, Mr. Chairman. Ted Poe and I both believe it's time for transparency in the Supreme Court. We want cameras in the Supreme Court. So I thank the judge for his passion on that subject. And Mr. Lovelady, let me add my voice of sympathy to you and your family for your loss. It's a terrible thing. Dr. Byman, listening to your answers to questions put to you, I assume one could conclude that this whole region of North Africa is maybe inherently unstable, or certainly less secure than some other parts of the world one might want to visit.
I think that's a safe assumption, sir.
There are active insurgencies throughout the region.
Yes, sir.
There are armed militias throughout the region.
Yes, sir.
There are jihadists throughout the region.
Yes, sir.
There are al-Qaeda elements throughout the region.
I would say there are al-Qaeda sympathizers and like-minded groups throughout the region.
Right. And then there are just, what the heck, why not, put on a bandolier and enjoy terrorism or insurgency, or there could be local grievances that fuel local indigenous militias and insurgencies as well.
Yes, sir.
And then there are independence fighters like Polisario, who have been fighting for a long time for what was formerly Spanish Morocco. Is that correct?
It's a long list, sir, yes. Yes, sir.
So, given all of that, and given limitations of our intelligence and intelligence sharing, you cited Algeria as an example, should the United States withdraw or retreat? Should we close embassies and consulates throughout the region?
My view is a strong no.
Why?
The United States has interests in North Africa, and also, as my colleagues have testified, what's happening in North Africa is not staying in North Africa. So we have to deal with it one way or another. It's not something we can simply turn our back on.
So we knowingly want to stay engaged, and we want to minimize risk and try to understand it, but we can't eliminate it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
And therefore, sometimes we understand that diplomacy can be dangerous when you go into areas of instability or insecurity.
Many diplomats I know, sir, very much believe that part of their job is to take on such risks.
Mr. Gartenstein, Ross, I was intrigued by your fairly definitive answer about arming rebels in Syria, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you on that because the concern I have is, I don't know, do the good guys wear white hats and the bad guys wear black hats? We just go right in and say, you will arm and we won't. Is that how it works?
Well, I think that, as you said, it's not as though the bad guys are wearing black. It's difficult to distinguish between the factions. There's a lot of mobility between them. That's why providing arms that would be a great danger to the U.S. or our allies is such a very dangerous game.
Do you believe that the United States, therefore, should not be arming any of the insurgents, any of the rebels in Syria?
I'm very skeptical of arming them in any way, but the administration has said that that's their intention. Thus, I think that preventing arms that could be of most danger, such as anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, is the thing that I would focus on. But yeah, I'm skeptical of the entire endeavor.
You made another point about that, which is, in an odd way, arms are fungible. The fact that you give arms to somebody you've certified as a good guy does not mean he doesn't turn around and sell it, or the arms are stolen, or just meander over time into hands we'd rather they not be. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And also, in many ways, the good guys and bad guys there, to use kind of a colloquial way to refer to them, are in many ways brothers in arms. Look at when the U.S. designated Jabhat al-Nusra for its linkages to al-Qaeda. All of the factions in Syria were outraged that we did so. There was no faction that came in and said, oh, it's a great thing that they were designated. Instead, the designation was extremely controversial across the board.
One of the concerns I have, and I'd ask you and Mr. Byman to address this in what little time I have remaining, but that's what worries me always about our plans. I mean, what's Plan B? What happens next? So Gaddafi goes, Mubarak goes, now what? And it is my view that we have actually limited leverage in shaping outcomes. And by the way, I just throw it in here, I was in Libya and Egypt last year, post-revolution, both countries. I actually was more hopeful for Libya than I was for Egypt, and I remain so. Your comment on that in the little time we got left.
Sir, I very much agree with where you're coming from. And I'd say, in addition to that, we should also be thinking about what our strategic interests are. For me, particularly when we went into Libya, it wasn't clear what strategic interest was being served. It served to hasten events in the region, which we already did not have a good handle on in terms of the effect on Islamic militancy. And I think as a result, if you look at the intervention in Libya, it actually made that particular problem set deeper. I don't think we put a lot of thought into that, and likewise in Syria, given how confusing the situation is, I think there's a great deal of danger and a lot of great potential for second-order consequences that we will regret.
I tend to have a slightly different view on this. I'm pessimistic we can shape what's going to happen in Syria now through a program of arming the rebels. But I do believe that a long-term program that does involve arms, but especially training, will at least give us some local capacity should Assad fall or should Syria fall apart. And that's not much, sir. I don't want to say that's something we can take to the bank, but it's better than nothing. Syria, the instability there is going to emanate throughout the region, and we are going to have to play a role, and having some presence there will be helpful.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence, and what I take away from that is we have to stay engaged. there are some options, but they're limited options, and we need to get used to the idea, though sometimes our rhetoric up here, you'd think otherwise, we're neither omnipotent nor omniscient. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Yoho from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate your testimony. Mr. Lovelady, thank you and your family for being here and sharing that compelling and moving story, and we sympathize with your loss, all of you. And also, as Mr. Weber brought out, how it brings home the importance of what we do here, and I think you've heard that across the board here. My questions go back to what we did in Libya. What have we learned on Libya? You know, we did the flyovers, we got in, we got out. Weapons were left there by other forces, whether it was the UN or NATO, and we know those weapons wound up leaving Libya, going to Algeria. And now we've got the situation where we've got to face in Syria. I mean, this is coming up. Decisions are going to have to be made, and we don't want to repeat mistakes of the past. And I'm hearing from Mr. Gartenstein Ross, you were talking about we need to arm the people over there, but we've done that again and again, and there's, way I understand it, there's over 1,000 different groups in Syria. Which one do you arm? And if we do that, when do you pull out? When is there a line that you said, all right, we've done enough, we need to back out? I'd just like to hear from all three of you what you think we should do in that situation so that we don't repeat the mistakes. And again, going back to Libya, what have we learned there that we don't want to repeat?
To be very clear, sir, I'm not advocating arming the Syrian rebels. I'm actually advocating the opposite.
Okay, I misunderstood you then in your testimony.
I think that doing so it would be extremely dangerous.
I'm glad to hear that.
The point that I would make, the overarching point I would make, is simply that the most dangerous thing would be giving them arms like anti-aircraft weapons and anti-tank weapons. Those are the kind of weapons that I think we would most regret sending to the rebel factions.
Okay, I misunderstood you then, because I thought you said that we should do that, and I'm thinking, I don't want to do that again. Mr. Is it Zen?
I think one of the important things that the United States needs to do is show a lot of leadership on Syria at this point. We're essentially ceding the ground to some of our allies in the Gulf, but the problem is our allies in the Gulf do not have the same interests as us in Syria. We've seen many private citizens in these Gulf nations who have been providing weapons and a lot of money to a bunch of different Salafist organizations within Syria, as well as jihadi groups. And even when there was sort of this trial run in December, when there were Croatian weapons that went into Syria via Jordan, even though they're supposedly going to the good guys, they actually ended up in the hands of Jabhat al-Nusra within a month. So I am skeptical about providing arms, but I do think there are other options in terms of leadership with centralizing the opposition in Syria, as well as also potentially using some type of no-fly zone activity as well. And then from there, because you have this centralized military capability in Syria that we have relations with, then potentially we could work with them after the Assad regime falls, if it does, to then deal with some of the other elements.
Let me interrupt you there. You're talking about a no-fly zone. I mean, what gives us the authority to do that? I mean, we do that unilaterally. We go through the UN, NATO. I mean, constitutionally, we're attacking a nation that's not attacked us.
Sure. I think we'd try the UN, but I think that Russia and China would block this. One other area could be through the Arab League, since this is sort of their jurisdiction, and if they want that, we could help
How much effort has the Arab League come out in support of this, or how much involvement do they have to help calm that strife over there?
Well, we've seen Arab states calling for help the past 2 years, even though they themselves probably don't want to themselves be involved in the no-fly. They can potentially help fund it, since they do have the money, in a similar way that happened in the Kuwait War.
Let me ask you guys this. Does China have interest in that area where the attacks were, where Mr. Lovelady died, as far as petroleum?
China has, I would say, two interests, sir. One is it's becoming a major importer of petroleum, and of course, the Middle East is a key area. The second is it's tried to secure contracts in areas where it's taking advantage.
All right, so they have a presence there.
I don't know about that particular part of Algeria.
Are they being attacked, have terrorist attacks against their interests?
They've had kidnappings and attacks in parts of Africa, but not what we would call terrorist attacks from al-Qaeda.
Okay, why do you think that is?
The United States, sir, is opposed by al-Qaeda for a whole variety of reasons. Some of it includes our policies in the Middle East. Some of it is our values. Some of it is simply because we're the face of modernity. It's a mix.
Do you think it has something to do that China just stands up? I mean, we heard you say something about the cowardice. You know, when we show up, we don't follow through, and so they look at us as being weak, maybe, and China not. Do you think that has something to do with that?
I think it's more that China stands on the sidelines, sir, and that's me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lovelady, thank you for coming. Sorry for your loss. I definitely believe that when Americans are killed, people need to be brought to justice. This could be for anyone who wants to weigh in. With respect to the Benghazi terrorist attack, why has there been, in your judgment, so much trouble bringing the perpetrators of that to justice?
I think part of it has to do with the weakness of the central government. They have had a hard time having a writ over a lot of the periphery, and actually the periphery has been able to blackmail the central government into doing a variety of things related to this isolation law that happened in their parliament, as well as sacking different ministers.
But what about U.S. actions? Why have our actions not borne any fruit thus far, given that 4 Americans were killed?
Sure.
And it's not as if these were just Americans who just kind of happened to be traveling. I mean, this was an ambassador. This was U.S. territory in some ways. And yet, here we are. I mean, we're coming up, it's almost a year later, and nothing.
I think part of it just has to do with the weakness of the central government and their inability to be able to really control what's going on in some parts of the country, and therefore, even if the United States would go in and go from Tripoli to Benghazi, as has been noted by the FBI and we've seen in the media, that there is a potential that you might have elements then try and attack them. So I think you have that issue going on.
No, I understand that. And it's interesting, when we had the State Department folks in front of oversight, the Libyan leadership, said it was terrorism initially, and they got really upset when we said it was because of a YouTube video. So I think our administration hurt the cause in that respect. The fact that we haven't brought anybody to justice, is that something that is going to likely deter future terrorist attacks? It seems to me that they figure that they've gotten away with it. It's likely to embolden more people to want to attack U.S. interests abroad. Does anyone disagree with that?
No, I fully agree.
With respect to the Algerian attack, how did the overthrow of Gaddafi, the revolution in Libya, did it play any role in that? I know that there were a lot of jihadists who were able to get weapons and operate more freely. So was there a linkage in your judgment to those Islamic fighters and the attack that happened?
Absolutely. One linkage is through arms. The other linkage is that Libya was used as a staging ground for the Algeria attack.
Do all the witnesses concur with that?
I also think part of it had to do with the French intervention of northern Mali as well, since a lot of the individuals melted away, as Dr. Byman mentioned, and went into northern Niger as well as southern Libya. So then they were able to use that as another different type of base for this attack. And one could argue that the attack on the In Amenas base was in retaliation to the French intervention in northern Mali.
With Afghanistan, there was this concern, I mean, it's still there, but al-Qaeda used that as training fighters, as a base of operations. And if you look at across northern Africa, I mean, it just seems to me that you could easily have parts of northern Africa end up with al-Qaeda type fighters, Islamic fighters, using that. Is that something that we should be concerned about?
In my view, absolutely. It's harder than in the past because of the drone program, because of greater U.S. attention. But when you have these ungoverned areas these become extremely dangerous if they're exploited by al-Qaeda.
And I'd add that another layer of concern is not just training, but also places where people can actually engage in live action fighting. Syria is one example. Mali has been one example. And let's watch the situation in Egypt. That could end up a very chaotic situation. I don't think that jihadists will be at the forefront of any sort of confrontation, but they certainly could end up one of the major beneficiaries.
And with Syria, this has been going on for a long time. As this has drug on longer and longer, that is actually, you've seen more and more of the foreign fighters go. So the extent to which this turmoil in Egypt lasts longer and you have fighting, seems to me that that would be a magnet for a lot of these fighters in northern Africa. So it's a very, very dicey situation.
I agree that it is. Like I said, I don't think that jihadists will be at the forefront in Egypt. They simply don't have an incentive to do so. If you have clashes between Brotherhood supporters and supporters of the military, that's a great chaotic situation where they can quietly build up their capabilities without being at the forefront of violence on the streets.
Well, I thank the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Lovelady, for your appearance, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair will recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a blog article by Walid Shubat, who claims to be a former member of the Muslim Brotherhood and has some intelligence information that I think would be very valuable to this hearing.
Without objection, be made part of this hearing's record.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the witnesses, do you know, is there any evidence of the Muslim Brotherhood that you know of, the Muslim Brotherhood's, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood's involvement in the attack that resulted in the death of our ambassador in Benghazi?
No, sir. I know of absolutely no information suggesting that.
Okay. Anybody?
No.
Not that I've seen, sir.
Okay, there's is there do you folks, are you aware of a terrorist organization called Ansar al-Shirari? Maybe Shirari.
Yes, sir. There are multiple branches in multiple countries.
Okay. And so this is a known terrorist organization. The Sharia, is it Sharia? Ansar al-Sharia, is that how I pronounce it? So this is a known terrorist organization?
Sir, it's a known jihadist organization. In a number of countries, they're not actually engaged in terrorism on the ground, but they make clear that they are aligned with Salafi jihadist ideals, such as the ideals of al-Qaeda. This is something that's very clear from the social media that the group puts out in countries like Tunisia and Libya.
Okay. Were any of the members of that cell, to your knowledge, been arrested for the attack that took our ambassador's life in Benghazi?
I believe there have been one or two individuals who have been detained in Tunisia as well as in Libya, but both have then been released based off of lack of information.
Mr. Shubat reports that 6 members of Ansar al-Shirari, that they were arrested in Libya, and presents a document that indicates that they, that they were involved and that they are Egyptians, of course, and not Libyans. Have any of you heard anything about that at all?
I've seen some press reports about Egyptians involved in the attack, sir, but as far as their affiliation, I do not know.
Okay. Mr. Shubat, who claims to have been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and may well have been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, I just haven't verified it yet, suggests that this terrorist organization has direct ties to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Is that something you know about?
Sir, I wouldn't infer that just from the national origin of individuals involved. We know for a fact that there is a large stream of Egyptian extremists who've gone into Libya. There are camps, for example, one set of camps is known as the Jamal Network, the individual who runs them is himself Egyptian. That also is a camp that has been connected directly to Al-Qaeda.
Well, in terms of this, this position is that it was not Al-Qaeda, but this Ansar al-Shirari terrorist cell that was involved in the attack, and that they were Egyptian, and that they're, in fact, part of his report, which I read and looked at the other night, is a news clip that is taken from a camera that one of the terrorist people were involved in the terrorist attack, or at least that's what they say. You could see armed people going back and forth, shooting going on, and some of the terrorists suggesting that they had been sent by Masari, and meaning the president of Egypt. Is the president of Egypt, he has a long, close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, does he not?
Yes, Mohamed Morsi was the president of Egypt before he was dispatched the other week, though I find these claims not that credible. There's no evidence to suggest, based off of anything I've seen, that the Muslim Brotherhood is linked to Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, or that any members of the Muslim Brotherhood were involved, or that Mohamed Morsi told members of the Brotherhood to go to Libya to conduct an attack.
So you don't know of any evidence that suggests that?
No, sir. Okay,
and you have not. I would appreciate if you guys would read this report and give me your personal analysis of it. This is, did President Morsi ever, during recent years, talk about the return of the blind sheikh, is that how you pronounce it? The blind sheikh that we have here in custody in the United States?
Yes, sir. That was one of the demands that he made to the U.S.
But he was, Masari, President Masari himself has made statements that this is important to him, and that it's a priority.
Yes, sir. That's something that he asked the U.S. to do. It's in Egypt, this is a rather big political issue, which he was clearly tapping into.
Or leading. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether a political leader is tapping into something in the population or if someone is creating it. Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for this hearing, and I think that the information that we were just discussing may well deserve a lot closer attention, and I'd like the opinion of your witnesses today on this report, and if indeed Mr. Shobat has the documentation which he seems to be presenting here, unless this is, by the way, part of this, what I've made part of the hearing, is a document that suggests, it's from Libya, about the 6 prisoners who were Egyptian, admitting that they were part of this terrorist unit and that it was connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. Unless that's a forged document, I think we should pay close attention and get to the bottom of this. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today and perhaps opening up an area or directing our attention to something that could help explain what the hell happened in Benghazi. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ask the witnesses to respond in writing to the request by Mr. Rohrabacher from California. And one last question, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, you alluded to the fact the United States may have a policy regarding the people who committed the Benghazi attack. What is the policy of the U.S. for the future, to take those people out or to capture those people and bring them back? What is the policy, if you know what it is?
Sir, I don't know what our policy is with respect to the perpetrators.
All right. And the Chair, without objection, will enter into the record an article out today in Vanity Fair regarding the timeline on 40 minutes in Benghazi. All members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. I thank all the witnesses for being here, the Lovelady family especially for being here today. This subcommittee hearing is over. Thank you very much.